Welcome, Duke alumni and friends, to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute. This virtual series is designed to help you keep learning, stay connected, and grow your Duke network wherever you are. Today marks the fourth and final session in our new professional development series called Career Kickstart, where you will hear from both expert voices and the real-world experiences of fellow Duke alumni. I'm Stephenson, Director of Professional Development with the Lifelong Learning Team in the Office of Alumni Engagement and Development, and I am so glad you're here. Thank you for joining us for using AI at work, navigating risks and opportunities. AI is transforming how we work, bringing both exciting opportunities and significant challenges. Today's session explores what young professionals need to know about how generative AI is shaping productivity, collaboration, and professional reputation. Session takeaways include understanding how employees use generative AI in knowledge work, considering how AI use may impact your professional image, and exploring ways to build trust and transparency when using AI tools. We will focus on how authenticity shapes professional presence and how feedback can be a powerful tool for growth. Whether you're just starting out and reassessing your goals, this session will help you move forward with clarity and intention. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat as we go along. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Jess Reif. Jess is a Ph.D. candidate in Management and Organizations at Duke's Fuqua School of Business. Her research explores how emerging trends in the workplace, like artificial intelligence, boundaryless organizations, and open offices influence collaboration and decision-making. Her work has been published in leading academic journals and featured in outlets such as Axios Incorporated, the Boston Globe, and Ars Technica. Before her PhD, Jessica was Director of Research and Development at CrossLead, a management consultancy and tech company in Washington, D.C. She also holds a BS in Industrial Labor Relations from Cornell University. Jess, welcome to the Forever Learning Institute. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I'm excited to interact with you all over the next 45 minutes or so, and to talk about what is currently my favorite topic, which is generative AI in the workplace. So like Anne mentioned, I'm hoping to make this a really interactive session, and I would love if you ever have questions or if you ever want to chime in on any points, feel free to just drop a note in the chat, and we can make this an interactive discussion. All right, so the learning objectives for today's session. First, we're going to talk just a little bit about AI in the workplace and some of the ways in which AI is currently being used in professional contexts. And then we're going to get pretty quickly into some of the career risks and opportunities that come from using generative AI. So generative AI, for those of you who use it, you probably recognize that it's quite a bit different than some of the technologies that have come before it. So things like Microsoft Excel, the internet, other tools that have sort of long shaped at this point the way that we work. Generative AI really does bring something different to the table, and we're going to talk about how that affects some of the things that we know about work and professional evaluation in a work context. And then finally, we're going to talk about how you can create value through AI use at work. So this is going to focus on responsible AI use, as well as some tips for how to prompt it more effectively and essentially generate output that avoids some of the pitfalls that are typically associated with generative AI. All right, so AI in the workplace. I'd love to just open it up with a quick poll, and I know we're a relatively small group here, so. Oh, okay. Thanks for taking the poll. Every day, every other week, very rarely. Okay, so we've got kind of some diversity here in terms of how often people use AI. Since we're a small enough group here, I'm wondering, would somebody who uses it every day, would somebody be willing to share what their sort of primary use cases are for AI, like maybe one or two of the things that you like to do with it? Copilot for summarizing emails and documents, editing and improving emails, training an AI agent, cover letters. Okay, wow. So it sounds like you all have some really sophisticated AI uses that you're already that you're oh, sorry, got the poll coming back up again. That it's already it sounds like everyone here has a lot of sophisticated things that they're already using AI for. So as we think about the way in which AI is commonly used in professional settings, you have already sort of covered some of the basic use cases. So it's things like getting information. That's one of the most common AI use cases. It might be interpreting the meaning of information from others. So for example, if I'm very technical, it might be me translating what I've written for a non-technical audience, providing advice to others, documenting, recording information. So there are just a lot of informational use cases for generative AI. And for this reason, it's gaining a lot of popularity, especially in knowledge-intensive workplaces where sort of the primary way that we engage with work is by thinking. So, as generative AI is rapidly proliferating in knowledge-intensive settings, there are a lot of new things to think about. So, unlike technologies of the past that simply performed routine operations and sort of followed a structured set of rules, and where we had to perhaps learn a language to interact with them, generative AI really does offer what is a seamless user experience in terms of our ability to get information. Um, so for this reason, there's a lot of evidence accumulating that using generative AI can actually really help us with performance on a variety of tasks. So, for example, there was a study done with Boston Consulting Group where consultants were either using AI or using their sort of traditional toolkit that was not AI generated, and they found significant improvements for management consulting. We've seen similar phenomenon in terms of problem solving, professional writing tasks. So there's really a lot of reason to be excited about generative AI. But of course, there are also some risks associated with it. So I'd love if you'd be willing to just sort of fill in the blank for this poll in the chat. So if others thought that you used AI at work, they would think you are blank. How would you fill in the blank to that sentence? Efficient. I love it. Up to date. Saving time. I love these very, very positive answers. Uh, Unfortunately, there is still a lot of stigma around AI use in a lot of different workplaces. So while I'm personally somebody who loves to use AI. I use it essentially whenever I can find a new use case for it. I look to see how it can make my work better. But unfortunately, there is still a stigma associated with it. So, anytime that there's a new technology introduced, there are oftentimes skeptics of that technology. So, even dating back to Plato, for example, technologies such as writing were originally criticized for the ability to sort of externalize knowledge can cause a question of whether the person who has externalized that knowledge actually has the knowledge. I see a comment in the chat about cheating with AI from coworkers. So that's exactly right. So there's a lot of perception that sometimes people who use AI maybe aren't using their full brain power or skill set. And that can introduce some attributional ambiguity in professional environments. So, for example, if I achieve a goal using AI, it becomes less clear to my evaluators whether or not I could have achieved that same goal alone. So, for this reason, there's been just a lot of sort of popular press around this idea that that AI use is stigmatized, and we've seen a lot of AI use actually pushed sort of to what's called a shadow IT, where people are essentially using either personal devices or unapproved instances of AI so that their organizations can't necessarily monitor that they're using it. And one of the reasons why generative AI is stigmatized in some workplaces is that there's sort of a series of myths surrounding it. So it sounds like most of you use AI relatively frequently, so you're probably sort of well acquainted with these at this point. But one of the myths surrounding AI is really just that it takes no skill to use AI effectively. So, for example, somebody who maybe uses it for the first time and has it generate a whole essay or a whole email might see it as something that's really easy to use, and then in their mind they perhaps think that it's not something that requires a lot of skill. The another myth is that this idea that AI does all the work. And when people interact with AI, they're just simply taking what AI gives and they're using that as their work product. And then the third myth is that all the time that is being saved from using AI sort of gets pocketed for the individual. So for example, if my job used to take me 8 hours a day and now using AI, it's only I'm only spending 6 hours doing that job. People might be imagining that I'm taking that extra 2 hours and just relaxing instead of doing more work. So the reality is often quite different than these myths, but it's important to consider these myths when we think about how to communicate about our own AI use. But the realities, of course, are that it does take skill to use AI. Prompting is something that, similar to managing employees, it really has, there are some people that are better at it than others. You really do have to give the LLMs guidance on how to do the work or accomplish the task you're trying to get them to do. And when people do let AI do all the work, it can lead to AI slop, which is the term that's increasingly circulating for AI generated work products that are not particularly effective. And then finally, the third reality is that oftentimes AI users are actually doing more work as a result of the time that they're saving from AI. So while we can all use AI and perhaps believe that it has the power to make us more efficient at our jobs, it's important to be aware that these myths are circulating because regardless of whether or not we agree with them, they can sometimes have a professional impact regardless. So my own research with a few faculty members at Fuqua has shown that people who use AI tend to be evaluated as lazier, less competent, less diligent, less independent, and less self-assured relative to people who use other tools at work to accomplish the exact same tasks. Now, I, of course, as a heavy AI user myself, it's not that I agree that these should be the perceptions, but we conducted these studies. It's been about 6 months at this point, so they're a little bit dated, but within the last year, and it was across thousands of manager participants. This was a very robust effect. So we do know that this stigma is sort of floating around out there, and is something that, as AI users at work, we all have to be very conscious of. So as we think about those myths that we just discussed, these really turn into opportunities for us when we think about how to communicate about our own AI use in the workplace. So, for example, if one of these myths is that it takes no skill to use AI effectively, one thing that you can do if you are using AI and you feel like you're using it in ways that are more sophisticated, can be really helpful to share those lessons with other people in the workplace. For example, if you found a new strategy for prompting that makes ChatGPT or another LLM able to do a task factor, actually able to do a task better, actually sharing that strategy with others can be an effective means of demonstrating some of the skills that are required. The second is we've got to sort of combat this assumption that AI does all the work. So if you do talk about AI use with, for example, your manager, it's important to talk about what you did versus what the AI did and be really prepared to kind of cleanly articulate that contribution. So for example, if you wrote the initial draft of a report and gave it to AI to sort of clean up and make suggestions, and then you took another pass at it, it's important to have that frame of reference so that you're able to explain what you contributed versus what the LLM did. And then finally, and this one is perhaps most important, really track your productivity gains from using it and be prepared to articulate them. So, for example, there are certain tasks for programming that may have used to take me 4 or 5 hours, but now using generative AI, the same tasks can be done in minutes. So if you have anything like that at work that you're using AI and you're really able to save time on, and you're able to repurpose that time towards other value add activities for your organization, that can be a really compelling way to debunk some of these myths about AI use. So before we move on to how we can actually think about creating value through AI use in organizations, does anyone have any questions or reactions to the myths? I'm curious, are these stigmas things that you've encountered in your own professional environments? And I think we're a small enough group that if you have an answer, please feel free to unmute and share it.
Hi, this is Natasha.
Hi.
Hi. Oh, sorry, I just realized my camera was still off. Yeah, so I was going to say our employer has actually really embraced the use of AI. Everybody has Copilot, has at minimum, in addition to much more sophisticated tools. We've had some, pretty widespread training on AI, how to be more effective, how to kind of be a better prompt engineer. And even interestingly enough, in our reviews this year, the review system that we use for our employee tracking had built-in AI as well through something called Textio. So it's really pretty highly encouraged here for efficiency purposes.
That's awesome. And I think you raise a great point in that organizations really, in order to get people to embrace AI, really do have to be sort of publicly encouraging of it because there are so many, just in the wider sort of workplaces everywhere in general, there's these myths sort of circulating and some skepticism about AI. So I'm really glad to hear that you're in an organization where they are encouraging and really leaning into AI use and doing so in a way that makes people feel more comfortable using it. Thank you for
Yeah,
sharing.
and it was interesting. The tide turned pretty quickly. And initially, there was skepticism, but within about a 3-month window, it had completely done a 180. So very, very, very fast moving. So really appreciate you being here for this class.
Wow, that's fascinating. I'm glad to hear that. Do you feel like the employee attitudes, like once the leadership team sort of endorsed using AI, do you feel like employee attitudes pretty quickly got aligned to that, or do you think that there was still some tension over in the organization over whether to use it?
I think initially there was just a little bit of uncertainty, like, oh, can I really use this kind of thing? But once the training started to roll out for how to use AI, how to use Copilot, even as just like the most basic thing, everybody is on board. I don't know a single person that doesn't use it quite frequently here.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm really glad to hear that your company is taking a proactive stance essentially to combat some of these social stigmas that can be associated with the technology. Thank you. Does anyone else have questions or experiences that they'd be willing to share related to professional stigma around AI use? All right, so we'll move on then to creating value through AI use. So, oops, sorry, there we go. So I think of AI use as really sort of falling into responsible AI use as sort of something that we can think about really in terms of two domains. So you can imagine that some tasks in your work environment are really, really high stakes, where if something goes wrong with the task, there would be consequential outcomes either for you or for somebody else in the organization or one of your external stakeholders. Um, and then there are, of course, low stakes tasks where perhaps it's something that you need to do, but the quality is less important or the outcomes are less likely to make or break some sort of organizational success. And then there's another dimension on which we can evaluate AI is really just the verifiability of output. So, for example, if there's a task that I'm using AI for, and it's something where I have no expertise in that domain, but but so where I can't evaluate the output, it becomes much more risky to use it. Whereas if it's something where I'm going to be able to quickly detect if AI did something wrong, either because I have the relevant expertise or there's like an objective truth that exists out there, that's another dimension on which it can vary. So I think of the sort of most dangerous use cases for AI is being situations where the verifiability of the essentially where the verifiability of the output is high, and you're able to essentially verify that things are correct. Oh, excuse me, I botched my order here. Sorry. I think of the safest places to experiment with AI is where the stakes are low and where the verifiability of the output is relatively high. So, in other words, when you have the right expertise to evaluate AI output, you're in a much better position to use it responsibly because you can essentially supervise it the way that you would, for example, an employee that was working for you. Whereas when you're in a situation where you're using AI for something that, for instance, perhaps is outside of your area of expertise, it becomes really hard to detect whether or not it's hallucinating or whether or not it's providing output that is perhaps not up to the standard that you'd like it to be. So you can think of this as being those two dimensions as being sort of ways to evaluate whether or not a use case is responsible. So do you feel like you can do you feel like you would be able to supervise a person performing this task? If so, it's probably safer for AI. And also, if it is relatively low stakes, it's also probably safer for AI to be involved. So next I'm going to talk through just a few different tips for prompting. So you've heard me use this analogy a few times now about sort of managing your AI assistant or thinking of it as being almost like an employee that you manage. And similar to managing employees, there are a few different strategies that we can use to be really effective as managers. So one of them is providing context. So one of the things that makes AI so unique from other technologies is that it can learn from the information that you give it and can actually update its responses to get better. So if you are, for example, trying to prepare I'm just making this up, but say you're trying to prepare a pitch deck for a startup, you could upload other examples of pitch decks that you really like or ones that have been successful, and it can learn patterns based on those examples in the same way that a human working for you would be able to. So one of the things that you can do really is just give it examples and context of the way that you would like your output to be. Another thing you can do is you can ask what they need to be successful. So this is, of course, guidance that you'd give somebody who is a first-time manager as well. But you can prompt AI asking it, hey, this is the task I need to do. What information do you need to do for me to do the best possible job on this task? I use this prompting strategy all the time, and oftentimes I'm surprised at the information that it needs or it feels that it needs to do the task in it, and that I would have otherwise overlooked. And then finally, be aware of your influence. So we've all probably heard of AI being a bit of a sycophant, or perhaps we've experienced a situation where we're interacting with ChatGPT or another tool, and it gives us really positive feedback on an idea that maybe we know in our minds is not so great. It's important to be mindful of that influence as we're interacting with AI. So as we think about providing context, three strategies for providing context. So the first being explicit about your desired output. So like I mentioned, whether it's sharing relevant attachments or providing information that'll give the AI context on how to do the task better. The second thing you can do is give it a perspective or a persona. So for example, let's say that you're about to go meet with a client and you know that your client is very focused on a particular outcome. For example, maybe they're focused on, they are a consumer packaged goods customer focused on gaining market share. You can tell the AI as you're about to go into this meeting, hey, take the perspective of a consumer packaged good executive focused on gaining market share. And it will respond as though it is in that sort of viewpoint. So it can be really useful to sort of give AI a sense of the perspective you want it to take. And then finally, again, just sharing relevant information. A big caveat here is, of course, you only want to, follow the rules of your organization. Only share the information that you're allowed to share. Some organizations may have enterprise instances where you can upload any document. Others may be very sensitive about what you upload, so make sure that you're conscious of any rules that might be in your organization. So related to this is this idea of sort of prompting with care. So, for example, if you instead of just giving a simple prompt like this, where you say like, "Hey, can you critique the sales pitch that I've pasted below?" Give it much more clear instructions, such as asking it to state the strengths and weaknesses of the perspective, strengths and weaknesses of the sales pitch, plus taking the perspective of the exact customer that you're targeting, and giving it that relevant example. So this is an example of what a strong prompt could look like. Similarly, in terms of asking AI what it needs to be successful, oftentimes it will give you a list of the things that it would need from you to be able to do your prompt more successfully. You can also use AI to write its own prompts if you haven't done this before. So if you, for example, have Claude and Gemini, or Claude and ChatGPT, or any combination of LLMs, you can use them to use one to write prompts for the other, and vice versa, or you can use even just the same one to write prompts in a new tab. This can be a great way to sort of expand on your prompt and ensure that it has the relevant information. So the last piece of advice that I would give on prompting is to just really, really be conscious of your own influence in terms of the way that you word a prompt. So in the same way that if you're a manager and you're managing an employee and you're asking that employee for input, and you sort of leak your own idea of what you would like the answer to be, it might influence the response. That is absolutely going to carry over to AI. So just as an example, if I ask ChatGPT about the same idea and I refer to it as my own awesome idea and I ask it to rate it, it will tell me, oh, it has an 8 out of 10 chance of succeeding. Whereas if I say it's my friend's idea, so I'm less attached to it, it's somebody else, but I give it the exact same idea, all of a sudden that idea is a 7 out of 10. Whereas if I say it's a student entrepreneur's idea, it's evaluated as being a 5 or a 6. So it's really important to notice how subtly you might be shaping the content that's coming out of the AI based on the context that you're giving it. So one thing I always like to do if I'm looking for a critique is to just say that this is somebody else's work. And that's a great way to get the AI to sort of to assume that I have no sort of ego in its response. So be mindful of your own influence. So that's all I have in terms of content for today, but I would love to, if you have any questions or anything else that you wanted to discuss on, anything else you wanted to discuss on using AI at work, I'd love to just open up the conversation to any questions you may have.
All right. As people are maybe thinking about what they want to ask you, Jess, I have a question for you. How do you see generative AI tools enhancing the productivity of young professionals in knowledge working settings? Like specific examples or case studies that you may can share of how AI has significantly improved outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that one way that AI can be really, really useful. So if you think about young professionals, specifically ones that are graduating from schools like Duke, where they're getting hired to do heavy thinking at companies, um, the so one of the things that generative AI can be really useful is summarizing large amounts of information. So just as an example, when I was an entry-level consultant back in 2014, dating myself, but way back when, I used to read sometimes hundreds or thousands of pages of market research, synthesize that into short reports. That process took at least dozens, perhaps hundreds of hours. Whereas now, a person who's using AI in a very sophisticated way can make that go much, much faster because it can very efficiently process information as well as point you to the documents that you actually need to review. So for example, if there are 100 reports on a particular topic, you may not need to read all of them as the consultant. Maybe there are 6 that are really important, and AI can help you pick out which ones of those are there. So that would be one example. There have been numerous studies. They're mostly targeted at specific types of work. So for example, in software development, there have been a lot of studies about how it improves the speed with which people can release new products. And so there's a lot of efficiencies in terms of programming. I would say the gains are really sort of dependent on the industry context and what the work is what the employee is doing. I see a question from Amy about hallucinating. Yes, that's a great point. So I did not. I should have provided a definition of this. So AI hallucinations are essentially when you can think about this as being a situation when the AI produces an output that perhaps in the surface level looks very coherent, but then when you look more closely at it, particularly if you have expertise in the topic that it's talking about, you can sort of spot that it's not quite right. So the way that AI models work is that they're essentially prediction systems that are always sort of predicting what the right next word is to follow the current word. And sometimes that will lead these models astray to provide information that is not particularly good. So this speaks back to that verifiability point where if you can't verify the output of the AI, either because you don't have the expertise or because you don't know anybody else in the organization who has the expertise, it can be a really tricky situation to use AI because you don't know if it's hallucinating or have an ability to check if it's hallucinating.
All
Yeah,
right.
go ahead.
I was just going to read that out for you, but go for it.
Oh.
Natasha has a question for you.
Thank you. Yeah, so the next one was, it would be great to hear the most commonly used generative AI tools, especially ones that do well generating downloadable, editable content. Great question. So all the all the open source tools seem to, sorry, I said open source, public tools where you can just buy subscriptions seem to be sort of moving into this space. So for example, ChatGPT now, the enterprise instance, you can download CSVs or PPT files from it. My personal experience has been that it's not quite there yet in terms of in terms of being the output a standard that a person might want. So I think there are lots of different applications. It really just depends on what your use case is. I think Beautiful AI is one of the ones that I've seen some people using for slides. There are other like ones that are meant really specifically for PowerPoint slides or for image generation or document creation. So I think it more or less depends a little bit on the task. For coding in particular, there are a lot of new tools emerging. So Claude Code right now, which is the software engineering specific version of Anthropic's Claude product, has gotten really popular. But I think that this is a tricky one just since there's so many tools out there, and I think which tool has the edge really depends on what your specific use case is.
Great, Jess. I think that goes well into the next question of what generative AIs are better than others for certain tasks. Do you have a sense of what we should put in our toolbox?
Yeah. So this is a great question, and it's one that admittedly is outside of the scope of my research. So I'm just speaking now as an AI enthusiast. So you can take that with a grain of salt. But I think that one of the things that like Claude seems to be much better at sophisticated writing type tasks. And Claude is also very good with computer programming and coding. Gemini, I find, is very good with information retrieval type tasks. ChatGPT, I consider sort of a general agent that can do just about anything, though I don't think of there being one thing that it necessarily does way better than all the other tools. I think a lot of the more sort of niche LLMs offer like sort of specific value as well. So for example, Perplexity AI is really good for research that is grounded in actual documents that it can link you to, whereas some of the other LLMs don't necessarily default to citing their sources.
That's great. That's a nice rundown of things that we could use in our everyday work life. I have a question for you, Jess. So with AI being such a new tool for many organizations, or maybe not so new, but it's definitely, starting to be integrated. How important is it for young professionals not only to use the tools, but to understand the algorithms and the biases that power them? You mentioned them here, but how do we educate ourselves on that? And how can we stay informed and not get overwhelmed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say I think that it's there's sort of the surface level understanding of how the models work. And I would recommend that anybody who uses AI models regularly try to educate themselves on just the basics of how they work, which there would be uh, sort of gentle introductions online that are non-technical for doing that. In terms of how things work on a much more technical level, like for example, how a large language model is built and trained, I think is perhaps a little bit less important to the daily user in terms of being successful with it. But having that sort of surface level knowledge of how the AI models work, I think is enough to give us more of an intuition for when AI models are going to be better versus worse. So just as one example, predicting future events is notoriously difficult for people who do it for a living, like stock traders, etc. And we know that generative AI, of course, has a lot of historical data to draw on, but we can't necessarily expect that because it has access to good historical data, it's going to be great forward-looking as well. So there are just certain certain insights I think that are more apparent when somebody has sort of knows more about how the tools work based on their historical training data. But again, I think the sort of like under the hood of how the model actually operates is less important to daily use of it.
Great. That's encouraging, right? To not have to have that scientific knowledge, but yet, an understanding of what you're doing. So you're making good prompts, as you're saying, and not getting data that you don't want to use.
Exactly. And I would liken it to like any other piece of technology that we work with, like whether it's driving a car or a computer, it's like, oh, it's good to know what that blue screen means or what that error
Right.
message means without necessarily having to fully understand the technical process that generated it.
Yeah. And are there places to find that data that you would want to educate yourself? Like, how would you go about that? Would you ask ChatGPT?
Yeah, I was gonna
To
say you
ask you?
absolutely could. I think that ChatGPT would be good at answering that sort of question. I know that there are some like basic articles from HBR, Harvard Business
Mhm.
Review, for example, that would offer sort of preliminary sort of introductions, particularly for business use cases for AIs. That might be a
Mhm.
good place to get started. There isn't a resource that jumps out to me as being sort of the most obvious for gaining that general knowledge. One book that I would recommend for somebody that is perhaps more interested is the book Co-Intelligence by Ethan Mollick that came out in 20, I think it came out in 2024. I would need to verify that, but it's relatively recent and it talks about both how the models work as well as strategies for prompting them more effectively.
Oh, that's fabulous. All right, I have one other question for you. How do you think generative AI tools will reshape collaboration within teams, especially virtual or hybrid work environments? What skills will young professionals need to develop to excel in these AI enhanced collaborative settings? Do you think that's the future?
Yeah. So this is actually my active area of research right now. It's really fascinating. I think the historically technologies have made us much more collaborative or able to collaborate more. So, for example, something like email made it so that we didn't always have to be in the same room as our coworkers or on the same continent as our coworkers, or something like Google Docs allows, dozens of editors at the same time. So there are a lot of ways in which technologies historically have really enriched our ability to collaborate. One
Mhm.
of the things that is interesting about AI is that it provides collaboration. Essentially, it's very similar to that might be typically accessed through a colleague. So I think there is a lot more. We definitely see this in our personal environments, but it's happening in professional ones too, where people are, instead of going to their colleague for advice or their friend for advice, they're going to AI. And I think
Mhm.
that shift has a lot of potential to disrupt some of the human capital structures and collaboration networks that have sort of historically defined knowledge work. And I think that as we think about sort of developing in our own careers and find ourselves asking, oh, like, I need this career advice. Should I go to AI or should I go to this mentor? I think it's important to think to ourselves that maybe it's harder to go to the mentor or the friend or the person, but oftentimes there's a value add there that there simply isn't from interacting with AI. So I would encourage everyone to prioritize maintaining their non-AI
Mhm.
relationships.
I love that. That's great. So keep the in-person in there. Don't take that out of the prompts. Okay, one last question, and then we can let our audience go. Looking ahead, where do you think generative AI will have the most significant impact on the way young professionals approach their roles?
Yeah, so I think that increasingly it's going to become an expectation that we become good at using these tools to do our work more efficiently. So there are a lot of variations of this sort of quote floating around in different industries, but essentially that employees who use AI are not that AI is not necessarily going to replace employees, but employees who use AI are going to replace employees who don't use AI. And I at least like to think that that is the outcome that we're headed for. Where being somebody who is a skilled user of AI will be a career benefit. And personally, at least, I think it offers an opportunity to redirect some attention that may have previously been directed towards work that feels like toil or taxing to more intellectually engaging and motivating work. So I think that there are exciting frontiers on that front, and I'm hopeful that I'm hopeful that people will continue to recognize those gains and experience them at work.
Oh, wonderful. Jess, this has been so fun. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun. And thank you so much, everyone, for your engagement and for your questions.
Great. Well, let me close this out. Thank you, Jess, for a great session, to our audience for joining us today. Thank you.